When an arrogant and conceited journalist wants to destroy Caroline Levitt's reputation, thinking that he is well prepared, then karma catches up with him, in the form of Caroline's professionalism and skill. Listen to this fascinating story to find out what the journalist's arrogance will do to him. The studio lights blazed down, their intensity almost blinding as Caroline Levitt stepped onto the polished stage. The air was thick with anticipation, the faint hum of technicians adjusting microphones and cameras blending with the low murmur of the live audience. The set was sleek and modern, with its glass desk and glowing backdrop of the New York skyline, but the atmosphere felt anything but welcoming. Caroline's heels clicked against the floor as she approached her seat, her posture straight, her expression calm. Across from her sat Eric Donovan, the veteran journalist whose reputation for cutting interviews and sharp-tongued takedowns had made him a household name. His tailored suit and perfectly coiffed hair gave him an air of authority, but it was the smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth that set the tone. He leaned back in his chair, exuding the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome of the conversation. "Ms. Levitt," Donovan began, his voice smooth but laced with condescension, "thank you for joining us tonight. I must say, it's not every day we have someone so young and, shall we say, untested, taking on such a complex issue as healthcare reform." The audience chuckled softly, their laughter a mix of amusement and discomfort. Caroline met Donovan's gaze, her expression unflinching. She had expected this, his dismissive tone, the subtle digs at her age and experience. It was all part of his strategy to undermine her before the discussion even began. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Donovan," she replied evenly, her voice steady. "I'm here because this issue affects millions of Americans, and I believe it's important to have an honest conversation about it." Donovan's smirk widened, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the desk. Honest conversation. That's an interesting choice of words. Tell me, Ms. Levitt, how does someone with your, shall we say, limited background, propose to tackle a problem that has stumped experts for decades? The audience murmured again, and Caroline felt the weight of their eyes on her. She took a deep breath, her mind racing through the points she had prepared. She knew Donovan's game. He thrived on making his guests defensive, on throwing them off balance. But she also knew that staying calm and focused was her greatest weapon. "Well, Mr. Donovan," she began, her tone measured, "I may not have decades of experience, but I've spent years studying the flaws in our healthcare system and listening to the people it impacts the most. This isn't about me. It's about the millions of Americans who struggle to access affordable care." Donovan raised an eyebrow, his smirk never faltering. "Studying, listening, those are admirable qualities, Ms. Levitt. But let's get to the heart of the matter. Your proposed healthcare reform bill has been criticized for being overly ambitious and, frankly, unrealistic. How do you respond to those who say it's nothing more than a pipe dream?" Caroline straightened in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the desk. "I respond by pointing to the facts, Mr. Donovan. The current system leaves millions uninsured and forces families into bankruptcy over medical bills. Our bill is designed to address those gaps by expanding access and reducing costs. It's not a pipe dream, it's a necessity." Donovan chuckled, shaking his head. "A necessity, you say? And yet, critics argue that your plan would place an unsustainable burden on taxpayers. Isn't it true that your bill would require significant increases in government spending?" Caroline's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her composure. She had anticipated this line of attack and was ready to counter it. "It's true that our plan requires investment, but it's an investment in the health and well-being of our citizens. Studies show that preventative care and early intervention save money in the long run by reducing the need for expensive emergency treatments." Donovan leaned back, his smirk turning into a full grin. "Studies, statistics, it all sounds very polished, Ms. Levitt. But let's be honest here. Isn't this just another example of idealism over practicality? You're promising the moon without explaining how you'll get there." The audience chuckled again, and Caroline felt the tension in the room rise. Donovan was pushing harder now, trying to paint her as naive and out of her depth. But she refused to take the bait. Instead, She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "With all due respect, Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice firm, "I think the real question is why we've accepted a system that prioritizes profits over people for so long. This isn't about promising the moon. It's about fixing a broken system that's failing millions of Americans." The audience fell silent, the weight of her words cutting through the tension. Donovan's grin faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Well, Ms. Levitt," he said, his tone sharpening, "if you're so confident in your plan, let's talk specifics. Shall we?" Caroline nodded, her expression calm. "Let's." The stage was set, the battle lines drawn. Donovan was ready to pounce, but Caroline was prepared to stand her ground. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that the truth was on her side. The studio's lights reflected off the shiny desk, casting a harsh glow that seemed to intensify the tension between Caroline Levitt and Eric Donovan. Donovan adjusted his notes theatrically, his smirk betraying his anticipation. Caroline, however, sat calmly, her hands resting lightly on the desk as she waited for the next line of attack. "So, Ms. Levitt," Donovan began, his tone syrupy but razor-edged, "you claim that this healthcare reform bill will make a significant difference. Let me read you a quote from one of your critics who said, and I quote, 'This bill will bankrupt middle-class taxpayers and create bureaucratic chaos.' How do you respond to such valid concerns?" Caroline gave him a measured look. "First, I'd like to address the assumption that this reform is purely a financial burden. The cost of doing nothing, of leaving millions uninsured and allowing rising medical debt to destroy families, is far higher. This bill ensures preventative care is accessible, which reduces costly emergency treatments in the long run." Donovan raised an eyebrow. "And yet, you haven't addressed the bureaucratic chaos claim. Surely you're aware of how large government programs often spiral out of control." "I am," Caroline said, her voice unwavering, "which is why this bill has been carefully structured to streamline processes and cut inefficiencies. Let's not forget that our current system already has bureaucratic chaos. This reform is about fixing those inefficiencies while putting patients first." Donovan chuckled, shaking his head as if her answer amused him. "Well, Ms. Levitt, you're certainly good at spinning answers. But let's not ignore the real question here. What experience do you have to back up these ambitious claims? Have you ever run a healthcare program? Managed a hospital?" The audience stirred, a murmur rippling through the seated crowd. Donovan leaned forward, his expression predatory. "Isn't it fair to say that you're out of your depth on this issue?" Caroline met his gaze steadily. "Experience matters, Mr. Donovan, and so does perspective. I've spent years engaging directly with people impacted by our broken system. Families drowning in medical debt, seniors choosing between prescriptions and groceries, and doctors stretched too thin to provide adequate care. My role isn't to operate a hospital. It's to fight for a system that works for all Americans." Her voice carried across the studio with quiet conviction, but Donovan wasn't ready to let go of the reins. He flipped to another card, his smirk deepening. "You talk about listening to families, Ms. Levitt. But are you aware that the majority of economists have predicted increased wait times and reduced quality of care under your proposed system?" Caroline nodded, her composure intact. "Yes, I've read those concerns. But I've also read the reports that show improved outcomes in countries with universal access. Quality of care improves when people can seek help early without fear of financial ruin." Donovan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "So you're suggesting we model our system after other countries? Do you think America should follow their lead instead of paving its own path?" "I think America should learn from others while forging a path that meets the unique needs of its people," Caroline answered confidently. "This isn't about copying. It's about crafting a solution based on evidence and values." The audience murmured again, the energy in the room shifting slightly. Donovan's grin stiffened, and he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the desk. "Well, Ms. Levitt, you've certainly come prepared with your polished responses. But let's pivot, shall we? Let's talk about credibility." He paused, allowing the words to hang in the air for effect. Some have said that you're simply too young and too inexperienced to be taken seriously in this debate. Do you really believe you're the right person to lead this charge? The insinuation was clear, and the audience's murmurs grew louder. Caroline's expression didn't waver. She had expected this, anticipated it even. "Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice steady, "I believe leadership isn't defined by age or titles. It's defined by conviction, preparation, and the ability to stand firm in the face of challenges. If that's not enough for some people, I'll let my actions speak for themselves." The murmur of the audience died down as her words sank in, but Donovan wasn't finished. His smirk returned, sharper this time, as he prepared his next attack. "Actions, Ms. Levitt? Well, let's examine those. If you're so confident in your plan, how do you explain the economic strain it could place on small businesses trying to provide health care for their employees?" Caroline adjusted her seat slightly, her hands steady. She could feel the tension mounting, but she refused to back down. She had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment, and she knew she had the facts on her side. "Well," she began, her voice calm and deliberate, "I'm glad you brought that up, Mr. Donovan, because if we're going to discuss economic impact, we need to talk about the current strain on small businesses forced to navigate skyrocketing premiums and inconsistent coverage options." Caroline Levitt squared her shoulders and met Eric Donovan's gaze directly. The intensity of the studio lights reflected in his smirk, but Caroline refused to let the heat of the spotlight, or his pointed remarks, rattle her. The audience sat in rapt attention, their murmurs silenced as Donovan shifted in his chair, preparing his next move. "Well then, Ms. Levitt," Donovan said, his voice dripping with false geniality, "you mentioned the strain on small businesses. Care to explain how your legislation intends to help them, when many of them are already struggling under government-imposed regulations?" Caroline leaned forward slightly, her tone calm and deliberate. "Of course, Mr. Donovan. Small businesses face tremendous challenges under the current system. Rising premiums, unpredictable costs, and limited bargaining power with insurance companies. The reform we're proposing creates a public option that allows these businesses to access affordable, stable coverage without compromising quality." Donovan raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Ah, the public option. Isn't that just a fancy way of saying government takeover? How do you expect businesses to compete when they're being edged out by taxpayer-subsidized programs?" Caroline didn't flinch. "It's not a takeover, it's a choice. Businesses and individuals will have the option to enroll, or they can keep their private plans if they prefer. The goal is to create competition that drives prices down while maintaining high standards of care." She let the weight of her words settle over the room, but Donovan was already flipping through his notes, searching for another point to exploit. He looked up, his smirk sharper than before. "Let's talk numbers, Ms. Levitt. You claim this plan will save money in the long run, but what about the upfront cost? The CBO estimates billions in increased spending during the first decade alone. How do you justify that to taxpayers?" Caroline remained composed, her voice steady. "The upfront investment is significant, but the long-term savings are undeniable. Preventative care reduces costly emergency interventions, and giving people access to treatment early keeps them healthier and more productive. It's a matter of priorities, investing in people or continuing to pay for inefficiency and suffering." Donovan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, his tone growing sharper. "And what do you say to the millions of Americans who don't want this choice forced upon them? Aren't you just imposing your ideals on people who are perfectly happy with the current system?" Caroline's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't lose her composure. "Mr. Donovan, I challenge you to find the millions of Americans who are perfectly happy paying exorbitant premiums, facing surprise medical bills, or being denied coverage altogether. This plan is about giving people real options, not taking them away." The audience stirred, their whispers a mix of approval and skepticism. Donovan's smirk thinned as he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Well, Ms. Levitt, you've certainly come prepared with your talking points," he said with a dismissive chuckle. "But statistics and sound bites only go so far. Let's address the real-world implications of your plan." Do you think it's fair to saddle future generations with the debt this program will create? Caroline didn't hesitate. I think it's unfair to saddle future generations with a broken system that prioritizes profits over people. The cost of inaction far outweighs the cost of reform. Our plan is fully funded through progressive revenue measures, ensuring that those who can afford to contribute more do so. It's about shared responsibility for the greater good. Donovan's eyes narrowed, his smirk now more forced than confident. He leaned forward, his tone growing more aggressive. And yet, Ms. Levitt, you continue to ignore the logistical nightmare of implementing such a system. Bureaucratic red tape, delayed care, fraud. These are the hallmarks of government-run programs. How do you address those concerns? Caroline met his gaze without flinching. Every system has challenges, Mr. Donovan. The question is whether we're willing to confront them and build something better, or cling to a broken system out of fear of change. This plan includes safeguards to minimize fraud and inefficiency, and it puts patients, not profits, at the center of care. The audience was now fully engaged, their earlier murmurs replaced by a quiet tension as they watched the verbal duel unfold. Donovan tapped his pen against the desk, his frustration barely concealed. "Well, Ms. Levitt," he said, his tone clipped, "you certainly paint an optimistic picture, but optimism doesn't pay the bills. Let's move on, shall we?" Caroline nodded slightly, her expression calm. She could sense his growing irritation and knew she was getting under his skin. She waited for him to launch his next attack, her confidence unshaken. Donovan flipped to a new card, his smirk returning. "You mentioned preventative care earlier. But do you have any concrete evidence that your plan will actually deliver these supposed savings? Or is this just another vague promise politicians love to make?" Caroline reached for a folder resting on the desk, her movements deliberate. "I'm glad you asked, Mr. Donovan, because I do have evidence, real data from independent studies and examples from other countries. I'd be happy to share it." Donovan's smirk wavered, and the audience leaned forward slightly, sensing a shift in the balance of power. Caroline opened the folder, the crisp sound of paper breaking the silence. "As a matter of fact," she said, her voice steady, "let me start with a report that highlights the inefficiencies in our current system." Caroline Levitt opened the folder sitting beside her, retrieving a bound report and placing it on the desk with calm precision. The soft sound of paper brushing against the polished surface broke the silence in the studio. Eric Donovan's smirk flickered, his confidence beginning to show cracks as Caroline met his gaze. "This report," Caroline began, her voice steady, "is from an independent organization that analyzed the inefficiencies in our current healthcare system. It details how preventative care and early treatment can reduce long-term costs by decreasing reliance on emergency services." The audience leaned forward, the quiet murmur of interest rising as Caroline flipped through the report, finding the specific page she wanted. She held it up, the text clear enough for the cameras to capture. "For example, in states that have expanded Medicaid, we've already seen measurable declines in emergency room visits and uncompensated care costs. This isn't speculation, Mr. Donovan. It's real data." Donovan shifted in his seat, his smirk tightening as he leaned forward, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Interesting data, Ms. Levitt. But let's not forget that data can often be manipulated to support an agenda. Are you sure you're not cherry-picking numbers to paint an overly optimistic picture?" Caroline set the report down, her tone unwavering as she replied, "I'm presenting facts, Mr. Donovan, facts that have been verified by independent studies. If you'd like, I can share additional reports that support the same conclusion." Before Donovan could respond, Caroline reached for another folder and retrieved a small tablet. She tapped the screen, bringing up a video interview with a well-respected physician. The audience murmured softly as the video began playing on the studio monitors. The doctor spoke clearly and confidently, outlining how preventative care had improved patient outcomes in their practice. They detailed specific examples of patients who, thanks to accessible treatment, avoided serious complications that would have required expensive interventions. Caroline paused the video after a few minutes, allowing the physician's words to linger in the air. "This isn't just about statistics," It's about real people, real lives, and real outcomes. Donovan's smirk wavered, his fingers tapping against the desk as he searched for a retort. Well, Ms. Levitt, you've certainly come prepared. But let me remind you, your opposition isn't just about numbers and outcomes. It's about trust. How can the public trust a system as massive as the one you're proposing not to fail them? Caroline held his gaze, her posture unyielding. Trust is earned, Mr. Donovan. And trust begins with transparency. That's why this reform includes accountability measures to ensure that patient care remains the priority, not profits or bureaucracy. The audience stirred, their murmurs growing louder as Caroline's confidence radiated through the room. Donovan's smirk was now a shadow of its former self, his frustration evident in his narrowed eyes. Before he could attempt another attack, Caroline leaned forward slightly, her tone growing sharper but still composed. Mr. Donovan, since we're discussing trust and accountability, perhaps we should also address your own record. The audience fell silent, the tension in the room palpable as Donovan stiffened, his brows furrowing. Caroline tapped her tablet again, bringing up a slide on the monitors. It displayed a series of quotes and statistics from Donovan's past interviews, instances where he had made bold claims or misrepresented facts. For example, Caroline continued, her voice steady, "Last year, you claimed that a healthcare proposal would gut the economy. Yet unemployment rates in states with expanded healthcare have actually decreased. Additionally, you've repeatedly argued against preventative care without citing credible sources to back up your claims." The monitors displayed each quote with corresponding data, leaving Donovan visibly uncomfortable. The audience's murmurs shifted from intrigue to disbelief as the weight of Caroline's evidence pressed down on the room. Mr. Donovan, Caroline concluded, her tone sharp, if we're going to discuss credibility, perhaps we should start with consistency. I believe the public deserves transparency, from journalists as well as policymakers. Donovan sat frozen, his smirk gone, replaced by a clenched jaw. The audience was silent now, the atmosphere charged with tension. Caroline's words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Eric Donovan's carefully constructed facade was visibly unraveling. The studio, once dominated by his sharp tone and smug demeanor, now felt electrified with Caroline Levitt's quiet command of the discussion. The glowing monitors behind her displayed the evidence she had prepared. His misquotes, unsupported claims, and flawed predictions about healthcare policies from previous broadcasts. The tension in the room was palpable as she paused, giving her words room to sink in. The audience, previously hesitant to react, now whispered among themselves. A few heads in the crowd nodded in agreement. Donovan's posture shifted. He sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw tightening as Caroline's calm but precise dismantling of his credibility unfolded. Ms. Levitt, Donovan began, clearing his throat, his voice strained but attempting to regain control. While it's admirable that you've clearly done your homework, I don't think this discussion is about me. Caroline tilted her head slightly, her expression serene. You're correct, Mr. Donovan. This isn't about you. It's about ensuring that the truth and the facts are presented to the public. That's what this discussion should always be about. Her words landed with undeniable weight. Even the faint hum of studio equipment seemed to fade as the audience collectively held their breath, waiting for Donovan's next move. But Donovan hesitated, his usual rapid-fire retorts absent. His hands fidgeted with the papers in front of him, and for the first time in years, the man who always had the last word seemed at a loss. Caroline sat back in her chair, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with his visible discomfort. The silence lingered for a moment longer before the audience broke into applause, tentative at first, then quickly gaining strength. It wasn't the kind of polite clapping reserved for moments of formality. This was the unmistakable sound of approval, of a collective acknowledgement that the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Donovan's face flushed, but he managed a tight-lipped smile, glancing toward the cameras with a flicker of desperation. He glanced at the clock in the corner of the studio, perhaps hoping the broadcast would soon run out of time. Caroline leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but unwavering. Mr. Donovan, I came here tonight to discuss healthcare reform because it's an issue that impacts millions of Americans. It's not about my credibility or yours. It's about the lives affected by a system that's failing them. Her final words hung in the air, punctuating the conversation with a sincerity that made even the most skeptical audience member pause. Donovan, for all his attempts to steer the discussion back to safer ground, found himself unable to counter the truth she had laid bare. The host, who had built his career on dominating the narrative, sat silently as the applause swelled once more. Cameras zoomed in on Caroline, her composed expression a stark contrast to Donovan's flustered one. The producer behind the scenes made the call to cut to commercial early, the screen fading to black just as the audience rose to their feet in ovation. As the broadcast ended, Eric Donovan sat motionless at the desk, his signature confidence completely eroded. Karoline Levitt, calm and composed, exchanged a brief, polite smile with the show's producers before stepping off the stage. The lights dimmed slightly, and the live audience began to filter out, their conversations buzzing with praise for Caroline's sharpness and grace under pressure. By the time Caroline exited the studio, the first wave of reactions had already hit social media. Clips of her calmly dismantling Donovan's arguments were being shared rapidly, accompanied by hashtags like #LevittVS.Donovan and #HealthcareTruth. In a matter of hours, the video clips from the segment began trending nationwide, drawing millions of views and sparking a heated discussion online. Caroline sat in the back seat of the car that had been arranged to take her home, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages of support. Friends, colleagues, and strangers alike were reaching out, congratulating her for standing her ground and exposing the flaws in Donovan's approach. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe, letting the weight of the night begin to settle. But as the city lights of New York blurred past the car window, Caroline's thoughts turned to the bigger picture. This victory, though significant, was just one battle in a much larger fight. The healthcare reform she had championed was still polarizing, still misunderstood by many, and still vulnerable to opposition from powerful interests. Her performance tonight had shown people the truth, but the work to secure real change was far from over. The next morning, Caroline awoke to headlines declaring her the breakout voice of the healthcare reform debate. Editorials praised her poise and preparation, while commentators marveled at how she had managed to hold her own, and even dominate, against someone as seasoned and shrewd as Eric Donovan. More importantly, stories began to emerge from ordinary Americans who felt seen and heard because of her words. Families shared their struggles with the broken healthcare system. Doctors explained how the reform would help their patients, and young people expressed hope that meaningful change was possible. As Caroline scrolled through the flood of responses, she felt a deep sense of responsibility. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. The truth is powerful, but only if you fight for it. Tonight, she had fought for the truth, and it had resonated. That afternoon, she posted a video message across her platforms, addressing the growing wave of support. Standing in front of a simple backdrop, she spoke with the same conviction that had carried her through the broadcast. "This isn't about me," Caroline said, her voice steady but warm. "It's about the millions of Americans who deserve better, who deserve access to affordable, quality healthcare without fear of financial ruin. Change is never easy, but it starts with conversations like the one we had last night. And it continues with action." Her message ended with a call to action, urging viewers to engage in the debate, to support reform efforts, and to hold their leaders accountable. By evening, her video had gone viral, solidifying her position as a rising leader in the fight for healthcare reform. Caroline sat in her office that night, staring out at the twinkling city skyline. The journey ahead was daunting, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The truth, she realized, had a way of cutting through the noise, if only someone was willing to stand up and speak it. She was willing, and now millions of others were standing with her. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.